The silence that followed the fall of the First Blight was not a silence of peace, but the heavy, suffocating quiet of a world holding its breath, waiting to see if the nightmare had truly ended or merely paused to gather its strength. In the ruins of the world that had been, the survivors looked up at the sky, where the stars seemed colder and more distant than before, as if the veil between the mortal realm and the taint of the deep had grown thin enough to see the shadow moving beneath. It was in this era of trembling aftermath that the Order of the Grey Wardens was born, not from a desire for glory, nor from the ambition of kings, but from the terrible necessity of a pact made in the fires of desperation. The First Blight had shown the nations of Thedas that their armies, their mages, and their prayers were insufficient against the tide of the Darkspawn, a tide that did not recede but only waited for the next cycle of the dragon to rise. The archdemon, that ancient god of stone and shadow, had been slain, yet the corruption it left behind seeped into the soil, into the minds of the living, and into the very blood of those who had fought to stop it. From the ashes of the fallen kingdoms, a council of the greatest heroes and the most powerful mages gathered, united by a singular, grim understanding. They knew that the Darkspawn were not merely beasts to be hunted down and killed, but a plague that required a cure that was as terrible as the disease itself. The mages, in their wisdom and their fear, discovered a way to sever the connection between the Darkspawn and their ancient masters, a way to sense the presence of the taint wherever it hid in the deep places of the world. But this power came at a price that no mortal could easily bear, a price that would separate them forever from the life they had known. They were offered a choice, to live as they were, vulnerable to the whispers of the Blight, or to drink from the Darkspawn blood, to become something other than what they were born to be. They chose the latter, and in doing so, they became the Grey Wardens, the living barrier between the light of the surface and the darkness below. The ritual that transformed them was a thing of profound sorrow, a moment where the light of the soul was extinguished so that the shadow could be seen. As the Darkspawn blood coursed through their veins, it did not kill them, but it changed them, twisting their flesh and their spirit until they were no longer entirely of the world they protected. They could feel the taint in the air, a low hum that vibrated in their bones, a constant reminder of the enemy that hunted them as relentlessly as they hunted it. They could sense the approach of the Darkspawn from miles away, a creeping dread that settled over the land like a fog. But with this gift came a curse, a slow, inevitable decay that would consume them from within, turning their bodies to ash and their minds to madness if they were not called to the final battle before their time ran out. They were the living dead, walking the earth in the twilight between life and death, destined to die in service to a cause that would never end. The early days of the Order were marked by a profound isolation, for the people of Thedas feared them as much as they needed them. They were seen as monsters, as outcasts who had willingly embraced the very thing they fought to destroy. Kings and nobles looked upon them with suspicion, and the common folk crossed the street to avoid their shadow. The Grey Wardens understood this, for they knew that they were no longer human in the eyes of the world. They had sacrificed their humanity to save it, and in doing so, they had lost the right to be loved or to be understood. They lived in the shadows of the world, in the deep places where the Darkspawn gathered, in the ruins of ancient cities that had been swallowed by the Blight. They built their fortresses in the most desolate corners of the land, places where the light of the sun barely touched the ground, and where the silence was broken only by the sound of the wind and the distant, guttural cries of the darkspawn. It was in these dark places that the Wardens learned to fight, to move as one, to think as one, to become a single entity of death and destruction. They developed their own language, a language of gestures and of the mind, a way to communicate without speaking, for they knew that the darkspawn could hear the sound of a voice, could sense the fear in a heartbeat. They learned to move through the shadows, to strike from the darkness, to kill with a speed and a precision that was almost supernatural. They became the hunters of the deep, the silent killers of the darkspawn, and the only thing that stood between the world and the endless night. But even as they hunted the darkspawn, they knew that their own end was coming, that the taint within them was slowly consuming their lives, that every day they lived was a day borrowed from the grave. The history of the Grey Wardens is a history of sacrifice, of lives given up in the name of a world that would never know their names. They fought in the deep places of the world, in the ruins of the ancient cities, in the deep places where the darkspawn gathered. They fought in the deep places where the light of the sun barely touched the ground, and where the silence was broken only by the sound of the wind and the distant, guttural cries of the darkspawn. They fought in the deep places where the darkspawn gathered, and where the silence was broken only by the sound of the wind and the distant, guttural cries of the darkspawn. They fought in the deep places where the darkspawn gathered, and where the silence was broken only by the sound of the wind and the distant, guttural cries of the darkspawn. They fought in the deep places where the darkspawn gathered, and where the silence was broken only by the sound of the wind and the distant, guttural cries of the darkspawn. The years passed, and the Blight returned, again and again, a cycle of death and destruction that seemed never to end. The Grey Wardens fought in every Blight, in every corner of the world, in every deep place where the darkspawn gathered. They fought in the deep places where the light of the sun barely touched the ground, and where the silence was broken only by the sound of the wind and the distant, guttural cries of the darkspawn. They fought in the deep places where the darkspawn gathered, and where the silence was broken only by the sound of the wind and the distant, guttural cries of the darkspawn. They fought in the deep places where the darkspawn gathered, and where the silence was broken only by the sound of the wind and the distant, guttural cries of the darkspawn. They fought in the deep places where the darkspawn gathered, and where the silence was broken only by the sound of the wind and the distant, guttural cries of the darkspawn. And yet, despite their sacrifices, despite their suffering, despite their isolation, the Grey Wardens remained. They remained as the living barrier between the light of the surface and the darkness below, as the only thing that stood between the world and the endless night. They remained as the silent guardians of the world, the living dead who walked the earth in the twilight between life and death, destined to die in service to a cause that would never end. They remained as the last hope of the world, the only thing that could stop the tide of the darkspawn, the only thing that could save the world from the endless night. And so, the story of the Grey Wardens continues, a story of sacrifice, of suffering, of isolation, of the living dead who walk the earth in the twilight between life and death, destined to die in service to a cause that will never end. The silence of the world is broken only by the sound of the wind and the distant, guttural cries of the darkspawn, and the Grey Wardens remain. the living barrier between the light of the surface and the darkness below, the only thing that stands between the world and the endless night. But to understand what follows, we must first turn our gaze from the cold, unyielding stone of the Wardens to the tangled, breathing dark of the wilds, where another shadow has long taken root, one that is not of the deep places, but of the ancient, untamed earth itself. Before we continue, there is something about the Witch of the Wilds and the circle of Magi that must be known, for in the quiet spaces between the forests of Ferelden and the swamps of Antiva, a different kind of magic stirs, one that refuses the chains of order and the cold discipline of the tower. In the deep, shadowed heart of the Korcari wilds and the murky, reeking waters of the Telari swamps, there dwell those whom the fearful call the Witches of the Wilds. Though they are no true clan, no organized brotherhood bound by oath or law, but rather a superstitious name whispered by the locals to describe the infamous Fleamith and her daughters, those who walk the earth with the weight of many years upon their shoulders. They are the Ashabilaner, the woman of many years, the mother of vengeance, a figure so old she seems woven from the very roots of the world, and her daughters, Morrigan and Yavanna, who carry her blood and her terrible power, shapeshifters who can wear the skin of beasts or the guise of men, moving through the world like smoke through a crack in the door. These women stand in stark, silent opposition to the circle of Magi, those who have been gathered into the stone towers of the Chantry, stripped of their names and their freedom, bound by the heavy iron of the Templars and the cold logic of the Chantry's laws, where the circle seeks to contain the magic within walls of stone and ritual, to prune the wild vine until it fits the shape of the garden. The Witch of the Wilds embraces the chaos, the raw, untamed force that flows through the blood and the soil. They remember a time before the towers, before the Chantry, when magic was not a tool to be regulated but a wild river to be ridden, a dangerous and beautiful thing that could not be tamed by the hand of man. The circle fears the wild magic, the magic that does not bow, and so they hunt it or they try to. But the wilds are vast and the shadows are deep, and the Witches of the Wilds are always one step ahead, always watching from the tree line, always waiting for the moment when the world will need the old ways again. They are the forgotten memory of the world, the whisper in the wind that reminds us that some things cannot be controlled, some things must remain free, even if that freedom is terrible and dangerous. And so, as we leave this quiet detour into the shadowed woods, let us remember that while the Wardens fight the darkness below, there are other forces at work in the world above, forces that are as old as the earth itself, and as wild as the wind that blows through the trees. The silence of the world is broken only by the sound of the wind and the distant, guttural cries of the darkspawn. But beneath that, there is another sound, the soft rustle of leaves in the deep woods, the whisper of the Witches of the Wilds, waiting in the shadows, waiting for the time to come. The wind that carries the whisper of the Witches of the Wilds is soon drowned out by a sound far more terrible, a sound that begins deep beneath the roots of the world and rises like a slow, suffocating tide. It is the year 930 Dragon, and the silence of Ferelden is shattered not by the rustle of leaves, but by the grinding of stone against stone as the deep roads open their maw once more. For a long time, the surface world has known only the quiet hum of peace, the rebuilding of walls, the planting of fields, the gentle rhythm of a kingdom that has forgotten the taste of ash. But the earth remembers what the people have tried to forget. Beneath the soil of the Frostback Mountains, the Darkspawn have gathered, not in scattered bands, but in a horde of such magnitude that it threatens to swallow the sun itself. They are led by a voice that speaks of a new order, a voice that promises to cleanse the world of the gods who have failed them. And in their wake, the land begins to rot. The first sign is not a battle, but a silence. The birds stop singing in the forests near the Frostbacks. The rivers run black and sluggish, thick with the oil of the deep. Then the villages fall. Lothering, a town of stone and timber, of hearths and smoke, is the first to feel the weight of the coming storm. It is a place where families have lived for generations, where the baker knows the name of every child and the smith knows the weight of every hammer. But when the Darkspawn come, they do not negotiate. They do not ask for surrender. They bring the end of the world with them, a tide of chitin and bone that breaks the gates and spills into the streets. The fires that consume Lothering are not the warm fires of the hearth, but the cold, green fire of the corruption, a flame that does not warm the blood but freezes the soul. The Emil family, the Hawks, the Valen, they are scattered like leaves in a gale, fleeing into the dark, their lives reduced to a desperate run toward a horizon that offers no safety. They carry with them only what they can hold, the memories of a home that no longer exists, the weight of a loss that will shape the future of the world. As the news of Lothering spreads, the kingdom of Ferelden holds its breath, waiting for the blow that will never come. The king, Marek, is a man of war, a man who has seen the Darkspawn before, who has stood against the Architect and driven him back into the shadows. But this is not the Architect. This is something older, something more primal. The Blight has returned, and it has brought with it a darkness that does not retreat. The Grey Wardens, those who have been exiled for 2 centuries, those who have lived in the shadows and the silence, are called back to the light. They return to a kingdom that has forgotten their name, a kingdom that has forgotten the price of peace. They come from the north, from the east, from the deep roads themselves, a ragged band of men and women who carry the taint in their blood, who walk the line between life and death. They are the last hope of the surface, the only ones who can stand against the tide. The war that follows is not a war of glory, but a war of survival. The Darkspawn pour out of the mountains, a river of death that flows through the valleys and up the hills. They burn the farms, they poison the wells, they kill the livestock and the children. They leave a trail of destruction that stretches from the Frostbacks to the very gates of Denerim. The people of Ferelden are forced to flee, to abandon their homes and their fields, to seek refuge in the cities that are slowly being swallowed by the dark. The roads are filled with refugees, a sea of desperate faces, of eyes that have seen too much, of hands that are empty. They walk through the mud and the blood, through the smoke and the ash, driven by a fear that is older than fear itself. They are the living proof that the world is not safe, that the darkness is always waiting, always watching, always ready to strike. In the midst of this chaos, a young man named Alistair is sent away to the monastery at Bornshire, a place of prayer and silence, far from the screaming of the dying. He is a boy of the blood, a prince of a kingdom that is falling, but he does not know it yet. He walks the halls of the monastery, he prays to the chant, he tries to find a peace that the world has lost. But the war is coming for him too. It is coming for everyone. The Darkspawn do not care for bloodlines. They do not care for titles. They care only for the end of the world, for the death of the gods, for the silence that follows. And so, the young prince waits in the monastery, unaware that his life is about to be changed forever, unaware that he will one day stand at the head of an army, that he will one day face the archdemon and decide the fate of the world. The war drags on, a long, slow agony that stretches the soul of the kingdom to its breaking point. The cities fall one by one, the fortresses crumble, the armies are shattered. The Darkspawn are everywhere, a plague that cannot be cured, a fire that cannot be put out. The people of Ferelden are forced to live in the shadows, to hide in the caves and the forests, to wait for the end. But the end does not come. Instead, a spark of hope is kindled in the heart of the Wardens. They gather in the ruins of Vigil's Keep, a place of stone and blood, of sacrifice and death. They are few, but they are strong. They are the only ones who can stand against the dark, the only ones who can bring the light back to the world. The final battle takes place in the capital, Denerim, a city of stone and gold that has been turned into a tomb. The Darkspawn have filled the streets, they have taken the towers, they have turned the palace into a nest of corruption. The Wardens march into the city, a small band of heroes against a sea of monsters. They fight through the streets, through the alleys, through the burning buildings. They fight with swords and with magic, with blood and with fire. They fight until their bodies are broken, until their souls are weary, until there is nothing left but the will to survive. And in the end, they reach the heart of the city, the throne room where the archdemon waits. It is a creature of nightmares, a thing of shadow and hate, a thing that has devoured the gods and drunk the blood of the world. But the Wardens are not afraid. They stand before the beast and they strike. They strike with the strength of the living, with the hope of the future, with the love of a world that is worth saving. The archdemon falls, and with it, the blight begins to recede. The Darkspawn scatter, they flee back into the deep, back into the shadows from which they came. The silence returns to the land, but it is a different silence now. It is the silence of the grave, the silence of the aftermath. The cities are in ruins, the fields are burned, the people are broken, but they are alive. They have survived the darkness. They have seen the end of the world, and they have lived to tell the tale. The king is dead. The queen is dead. The world has changed forever. But the Wardens are still there, standing in the ruins, watching the sun rise over a world that has been saved but not healed. They know that the Darkspawn are not gone, that they are only sleeping, waiting for the next time the world will be weak. They know that the war is not over, that it has only just begun. And so, the story of the Fifth Blight ends not with a triumph, but with a whisper. It ends with the sound of the wind blowing through the ruins of Denerim, with the sound of the birds returning to the forests, with the sound of the people beginning to rebuild. It ends with the memory of the dead, with the pain of the living, with the knowledge that the world is fragile, that the darkness is always waiting, that the light is always in danger. The Fifth Blight is over, but the story of Ferelden is not. It is a story of survival, of sacrifice, of the enduring spirit of a people who have faced the end of the world and lived to see another day. It is a story that will be told for generations, a story that will remind the world of the price of peace, of the cost of freedom, of the darkness that lies beneath the surface of the earth. And as the sun sets on the ruins of Denerim, the Wardens stand watch, knowing that their work is never done, knowing that the shadows are always waiting, knowing that the world is never truly safe. The silence of the world is broken only by the sound of the wind and the distant, guttural cries of the darkspawn. But beneath that, there is another sound, the soft rustle of leaves in the deep woods, the whisper of the witches of the wilds, waiting in the shadows, waiting for the time to come. The silence that followed the fall of the Arl of Redcliffe was not a true silence, but a heavy, suffocating pause, a moment where the world held its breath before the storm broke. In the valley of Ostagar, the morning mist clung to the grass like a shroud, damp and cold, concealing the movements of the army that had gathered there. King Cailan of Ferelden stood upon the ridge, his armor gleaming with a false sense of security, his eyes fixed on the horizon where the trees seemed to bow in a silent, ominous reverence. He believed he was prepared, that the steel of his knights and the fire of his mages were enough to hold back the tide of the darkspawn. He did not know that the ground beneath his feet was already trembling with the footsteps of 1,000,000 enemies, that the very air was thick with the scent of rot and iron, the perfume of a blight that had waited in the deep places of the earth for centuries to rise again. The warden, a figure of quiet resolve amidst the clamor of the court, stood nearby, feeling the weight of the ancient blood that ran through their veins, a blood that called to them, a whisper in the back of the mind that warned of the coming shadow. The battle began not with a roar, but with a sudden, terrifying eruption from the earth itself. The ground split open, and from the fissures poured the darkspawn, a river of chitin and teeth that seemed to have no end. The soldiers of Ferelden, brave and well-trained, met the horde with a cry of defiance, but it was a cry that was quickly swallowed by the chaos. The darkspawn did not fight with honor or strategy. They fought with a singular, mindless purpose, to destroy all that was living, to consume the light and leave only the ash. The king fought with the fury of a man who knew he was the last hope of his kingdom, his sword flashing in the gray light. But the numbers were too great, the darkness too deep. The warden watched as the lines of the army broke, as the knights fell one by one, their armor shattered, their blood staining the mud that would soon become a graveyard. The air was filled with the screams of the dying, the clash of steel, and the guttural roars of the ogres and hurlocks that tore through the ranks with terrifying ease. In the midst of the slaughter, the warden saw the king fall, a tragic end to a reign that had been marked by hope and now ended in despair. The king's death was not just the loss of a ruler, but the loss of a symbol, the breaking of the chain that held the kingdom together. The warden, driven by the instinct of the Grey Warden, moved through the chaos, a ghost in the storm, seeking a way to survive, to carry the flame of resistance forward. They found themselves surrounded, the darkspawn closing in like a tide. But then came the moment of transformation, the moment when the warden's blood sang with the power of the ancient magic, the power that allowed them to see the fade, to touch the spirits, to command the shadows. The warden struck down the darkspawn with a strength that was not their own, a strength borrowed from the ancestors who had fought this war before. And in that moment, they became something more than a soldier, something more than a man or a woman. They became a warden, a guardian of the world, a bearer of the light in the darkness. The battle raged on, a chaotic dance of death and destruction that seemed to have no end. The darkspawn swarmed over the bodies of the dead, feeding on the flesh of their enemies, their eyes glowing with a malevolent intelligence. The warden fought with a desperation that was born of fear, but also of hope, the hope that there was still a chance to save the kingdom, to stop the blight before it consumed everything. They saw the mages of the circle of magi fighting alongside the soldiers, their spells lighting up the battlefield with flashes of fire and ice, but even their magic was not enough to hold back the tide. The Darkspawn were too many, too strong, too relentless. The warden knew that they could not win this battle, that they could not save everyone, but they could save themselves. They could carry the story of the battle to the others. They could keep the flame of resistance alive. As the sun began to set, casting long, bloody shadows across the battlefield, the warden made their escape, fleeing through the woods, the sounds of the battle fading behind them. They were alone, wounded and bleeding, but alive. They carried with them the memory of the dead, the faces of the king and his knights, the screams of the dying, the smell of the rot. They carried the weight of the world on their shoulders, the knowledge that the blight had begun, that the darkness had returned, and that it was up to them to stop it. The warden walked through the forest, the trees whispering their secrets, the wind carrying the voices of the dead, and they knew that this was only the beginning, that the long road ahead would be filled with more battles, more deaths, more sacrifices. But they also knew that they were not alone, that there were others who had survived, others who were waiting for them, others who would join them in the fight against the darkness. The warden's journey was a journey of survival, of finding their place in the world, of learning to use the powers that had been awakened within them. They traveled through the lands of Ferelden, seeing the devastation that the blight had left in its wake. The villages burned, the fields barren, the people living in fear. They met with the other wardens, the survivors of the battle, and together they began to plan, to organize, to prepare for the long war that lay ahead. They knew that the blight was not just an army of monsters, but a corruption of the world itself, a sickness that had taken hold of the earth and would not be easily cured. They knew that they would have to fight not just the Darkspawn, but the despair, the fear, the hopelessness that threatened to consume the people of Ferelden. The warden's rise was not a rise to power, but a rise to responsibility, a rise to the burden of leadership, the burden of hope. They became the symbol of the resistance, the beacon of light in the darkness, the one who would lead the people of Ferelden to victory. They traveled to the circle of magi, to the Dalish elves, to the dwarves of Orzammar, seeking allies, seeking weapons, seeking knowledge. They learned of the ancient magic of the Grey Wardens, the magic that allowed them to kill the archdemons, the magic that was the only hope of stopping the blight. They learned of the sacrifices that had been made in the past, the sacrifices that would have to be made again, the sacrifices that were necessary to save the world. The warden's journey was a journey of the soul, a journey into the depths of the fade, into the shadows of the mind, into the darkness of the heart. They faced their own fears, their own doubts, their own demons, and they emerged stronger, more determined, more ready to face the challenges that lay ahead. They learned that the true enemy was not the Darkspawn, but the darkness within themselves, the darkness that threatened to consume them if they were not careful. They learned that the light was not just a weapon, but a guide, a path that led them through the darkness, a path that led them to the truth, to the meaning of their existence. The warden's rise was the beginning of a new age, an age of hope, of resistance, of the enduring spirit of the people of Ferelden. They knew that the road ahead would be long and difficult, that there would be many battles, many deaths, many sacrifices, but they also knew that they could win, that they could stop the Blight, that they could save the world. They knew that the darkness was always waiting, that the shadows were always lurking, but they also knew that the light was always there, waiting to be kindled, waiting to shine. And so the warden walked on through the ruins of the past, through the shadows of the present into the unknown future, carrying the flame of hope, carrying the spirit of the people, carrying the weight of the world on their shoulders, knowing that they were the last hope, the last line of defense, the last stand against the darkness. The wind blew through the ruins of Ostagar, carrying the whispers of the dead, the cries of the living, the songs of the future, and the warden walked on into the darkness, into the light, into the unknown, ready to face whatever came next, ready to fight, ready to die, ready to save the world. The silence that fell upon the Frostback Mountains was not the quiet of peace, but the heavy, suffocating stillness of a tomb that has not yet been sealed. While the surface world breathed a ragged sigh of relief as the Blight receded, and the armies of Ferelden turned their eyes toward the rebuilding of their shattered lands, a deeper, older wound remained open beneath the stone. The dwarven kingdom of Orzammar, that great Tig which had once been the beating heart of an empire that spanned the roots of the world, now lay in the grip of a sickness that no medicine could cure. The surface dwellers knew the Darkspawn as a plague to be fought and purged, but for the dwarves, the Darkspawn were a rot that had eaten away the very marrow of their history, a corruption that had turned the sacred stone against its children. For generations, the stone had been their god, their law, their identity. Yet now the stone itself seemed to weep with a black ichor that dripped from the ceiling of the throne room, a constant reminder of the usurper who had seized the crown. It was in this shadowed hour that the warden descended, leaving the green fields and the blue skies of the surface for the cold, unyielding darkness of the deep. The journey down was a pilgrimage into the belly of a beast that had forgotten its own name. The air grew thick with the taste of iron and old dust, a flavor that had not changed in 1,000 years, yet it now carried the scent of decay. The great gates of Orzammar stood open, not in welcome, but in a desperate, silent plea for salvation. Inside, the city was a labyrinth of shadows, where the torches flickered with a sickly yellow light that could not pierce the gloom of the lower levels. The streets were empty of the bustling crowds that once filled them with the clatter of hammers and the song of the masons. Instead, they were patrolled by the desperate and the dying, their faces gaunt, their eyes hollowed by the fear of the blackened stone that threatened to consume them all. The throne room of Orzammar was a cavern of terrifying grandeur, a vast chamber carved from a single living rock that had been shaped by the hands of ancestors who believed themselves immortal. Upon the throne sat the king, but he was no longer a man of flesh and blood. He was a hollow shell, a vessel for the Darkspawn taint, his eyes clouded with a milky film, his mouth twisted into a rictus of eternal agony. He spoke with a voice that was not his own, a guttural sound that echoed off the walls like the grinding of tectonic plates. The usurper had claimed the throne, and with it, the legitimacy of the kingdom, but his rule was built on a foundation of lies and blood. The dwarves, proud and stubborn as the stone they loved, had been forced to bow to a monster, to serve a master who would one day bring the end of their people. The caste system, once the rigid structure that held the society together, had fractured under the weight of this corruption. The nobles were dead or in hiding. The merchants had fled or were dead, and the laborers were left to scavenge in the ruins of their own home. The warden walked through the city, a solitary figure in a world of shadows, carrying the weight of a kingdom that had forgotten how to hope. The journey was not one of conquest, but of reclamation. Every step was a battle against the darkness that sought to claim the soul of the city. The warden met with the remnants of the resistance, the few who had refused to bow to the taint, who had hidden in the deepest corners of the Tig, waiting for a sign that the light could still be kindled. Among them was the former prince who had been cast out and exiled, his heart broken by the betrayal of his own people, yet still burning with the fire of a true heir. He had seen the truth of the usurper, had witnessed the corruption of the throne, and had sworn to restore the honor of Orzammar, even if it meant his own death. The warden and the prince formed an alliance, a bond forged in the fires of desperation, a union of surface and deep, of stranger and native, united by a common purpose. The path to the throne room was a gauntlet of horrors, a descent into the very heart of the corruption. The warden and the prince fought through the corrupted darkspawn, the twisted creatures that had been the defenders of the throne, now turned into monsters by the taint. The battles were brutal and silent, fought in the dim light of the torches, the only sounds the clash of steel and the guttural roars of the enemies. The warden moved with a grace that belied the weight of the armor, a dancer in the dark, striking with precision and purpose. The prince fought with the fury of a man who had lost everything, his sword a blur of motion, his heart a furnace of rage and grief. Together, they pushed through the corridors, through the gates, through the halls of the palace, each step bringing them closer to the truth, closer to the end of the nightmare. When they finally reached the throne room, the air was thick with the stench of decay, the very stone seeming to writhe with the corruption. The usurper sat upon the throne, a figure of horror, a monster that had once been a man. The warden and the prince stood before him, two small figures in a vast hall, yet they were not afraid. They had come to reclaim the throne, to restore the honor of Orzammar, to bring the light back to the deep. The battle that followed was a clash of wills, a struggle for the soul of the kingdom. The usurper fought with the strength of 1,000 darkspawn, his movements a blur of violence, his voice a roar that shook the foundations of the city. But the warden and the prince stood firm, their swords a barrier against the darkness, their hearts a beacon of hope. In the end, the usurper fell, his body crumbling into dust, the taint that had sustained him dissipating into the air. The throne was empty, the corruption broken, the kingdom free. The warden and the prince stood before the throne, the silence of the hall now a silence of peace, a silence of hope. The people of Orzammar emerged from the shadows, their faces filled with tears and joy, their hearts filled with the light that had been extinguished for so long. The kingdom was reclaimed, the honor restored, the future once again open. The warden looked around the hall at the people, at the stone, at the throne, and knew that the work was not done. The darkness was still out there, the darkspawn still lurked in the deep, the taint still waited in the shadows. But for now there was light, there was hope, there was a future. The warden turned to the prince, and together they walked out of the throne room into the streets of Orzammar, into the light of a new day. The reclamation of Orzammar was not the end of the story, but the beginning of a new chapter. The dwarves had been tested, had been broken, but they had not been defeated. They had found the strength to rise again, to rebuild their kingdom, to reclaim their honor. The warden had left a legacy, a memory of the day when the light returned to the deep. The people of Orzammar would remember the warden, the stranger who had come from the surface, who had fought for them, who had saved them. They would tell the story of the warden to their children, and their children to their children, a story of hope, of courage, of the enduring spirit of the dwarves. The stone would remember, the deep would remember, the world would remember. The warden walked on into the unknown, carrying the flame of hope, carrying the spirit of the people, carrying the weight of the world on their shoulders, knowing that they were the last hope, the last line of defense, the last stand against the darkness. The wind blew through the halls of Orzammar, carrying the whispers of the dead, the cries of the living, the songs of the future, and the warden walked on into the darkness, into the light, into the unknown, ready to face whatever came next, ready to fight, ready to die, ready to save the world. Before we continue, there is something about the Silent Grove and the Mage-Templar War that must be known, for the shadows that fell upon the deep stone of Orzammar were merely a reflection of a far older, far more pervasive darkness that had been festering upon the surface for generations. In the city-state of Kirkwall, where the sea mist clings to the stone, and the air is thick with the salt of the ocean and the sweat of labor, a quiet tragedy unfolded that would eventually crack the very foundation of the world. It began in the Silent Grove, a place where the mages of the Chantry sought to find peace, to find a way to live without the iron shackles of the Templars, only to find that the silence they sought was the silence of the grave. The Chantry, in its infinite wisdom, or perhaps in its infinite fear, had decided that the magic of the mages was a disease that could not be cured, only excised, and so the Templars, the sword arm of the Chantry, were sent to silence the grove. They came with torches and with steel, and they found not a sanctuary but a slaughterhouse, where the blood of the innocent stained the roots of the ancient trees, and the screams of the dying were swallowed by the wind. This was the spark that ignited the fire, the moment when the fear of the Chantry turned into a war that would consume everything in its path. The mages, driven to the brink, rose up in defiance, tearing down the walls of the circle, burning the temples and striking at the heart of the Templar order, while the Templars, blinded by their dogma, struck back with a fury that knew no mercy, turning the streets of Kirkwall into a killing field where brother fought against brother and friend fought against friend. The war was not fought for glory or for power, but for survival, for the right to exist in a world that feared the very breath of the mages. It was a war of whispers and shadows, of betrayals and of desperate acts of violence, a war that left the city in ruins and the people in tears. The silence of the grove had been broken, but the silence that followed was far more terrible, for it was the silence of a world that had forgotten how to love, how to trust, how to forgive. The war would spread like a plague across the land, tearing apart the fragile peace that had been built upon the bones of the past, and it would be the Inquisition that would rise from the ashes to try to mend the tears in the world, to try to heal the wounds that the war had left behind. But to understand the pain that the Inquisition would face, to understand the weight of the burden that they would carry, one must first understand the silence of the grove, the blood that was shed in the name of fear, and the war that would change the world forever. The story of the Silent Grove is a story of loss, of the loss of innocence, of the loss of hope, of the loss of the very thing that made the mages human. And it is a story that must be told, if only to remember the cost of the war, the cost of the fear, the cost of the silence. And so, as we turn our gaze back to the path of the Warden, we must carry with us the memory of the silent grove, the memory of the war that was to come, and the memory of the pain that would soon engulf the world. For the darkness that had been awakened in Kirkwall was but a prelude to the darkness that would soon fall upon the land. The silence that followed the fall of the silent grove was not a true silence, but a heavy, suffocating quiet that seemed to press against the ears of the world, waiting for the next scream to tear it apart. In the city of Kirkwall, where the sea wind usually carried the scent of salt and the cries of gulls, the air grew thick with a different kind of tension, a foreboding that settled into the very stones of the district walls and the cobbles of the merchant quarter. It was a city built upon the bones of the old Teventer Imperium, a place where the shadows of ancient magic still lingered in the corners of the chantry and the grand halls of the nobility. Yet it was a city that had forgotten the true nature of the darkness that slept beneath its foundations. The people of Kirkwall, with their bustling markets and their vibrant festivals, believed themselves safe behind their high walls, unaware that a conspiracy was weaving its threads through the very fabric of their society. A conspiracy born not of human malice alone, but of a deeper, more ancient hunger that had been stirring in the deep roads for centuries. The Darkspawn, those twisted children of the old gods who had been cast into the earth when the First Blight had swept across the continent, had long since learned to hide their movements, to bide their time while the surface world grew complacent. They did not march in the open anymore, not since the days when the Grey Wardens had driven them back into the tunnels and the caverns, but they moved like water, seeping through the cracks in the earth, finding the weak points in the defenses of the dwarves and the humans alike. And in Kirkwall, there was a weakness that they had identified, a fracture in the soul of the city that could be exploited to bring about a catastrophe far greater than any single blight. For the Darkspawn did not merely seek to destroy, they sought to corrupt, to twist the very magic that flowed through the veins of the world into a weapon that could shatter the barriers between the physical realm and the void. The conspiracy began in the shadows, in the dimly lit corners of the Hanged Man's tavern and the back rooms of the merchant houses, where men and women spoke in hushed tones of the coming storm. They spoke of a mage who had been cast out of the circle, a woman of great power and terrible ambition who had found a new patron in the most unlikely of places. She was not a servant of the Darkspawn, not in the way that the slaves of the Blight were servants, but she was a tool in their hands, a vessel for their will, for she had sought power that could only be granted by the old gods themselves. And so, she walked the streets of Kirkwall, her eyes cold and her heart filled with a hunger that could not be sated by gold or glory, but only by the release of the ancient evil that slept beneath the city. The chantry, with its white spires and its golden bells, stood as a beacon of light in the darkness, but even the light could not reach every corner of the city. The Templars, those sworn protectors of the mages and the people, patrolled the streets with their swords at their sides, their armor gleaming in the moonlight, but they were blind to the true nature of the threat that was gathering. They believed that the danger lay only in the mages who sought to break the laws of the chantry, in the rogue apostates who fled the circle to practice their magic in secret. They did not know that the danger was already within their walls, that the Darkspawn had found a way to infiltrate the city, to move among the people, to poison the wells of the city and the hearts of its leaders. The first sign of the conspiracy was the disappearance of the mages, the ones who had been sent to the circle to be trained, the ones who had been chosen for their talent and their potential. They vanished one by one, taken from their beds in the middle of the night, their screams muffled by the thick walls of the city, their bodies never found. The people of Kirkwall whispered of ghosts, of demons that stalked the streets at night, but the truth was far more terrible. The Darkspawn had found a way to communicate with the mages, to offer them power in exchange for their souls, and many had accepted the bargain, for they were desperate for the power that the chantry had denied them. They became the first of the new breed of Darkspawn, not the mindless brutes that had plagued the world for centuries, but the cunning, the intelligent, the ones who could walk among the people and weave their webs of deceit. The city of Kirkwall began to change, slowly at first, then with a terrifying speed. The streets grew darker, the shadows longer, and the people grew more fearful. The merchants closed their shops early. The children were kept indoors, and the streets were filled with the sound of footsteps, the clinking of armor, and the prayers of the faithful. The chantry tried to maintain order, to reassure the people that they were safe, but the fear was spreading like a disease, and no amount of prayer could stop it. The Templars, too, began to feel the weight of the conspiracy, for they could not protect the people from a threat that they did not understand, a threat that was not a single enemy, but 1,000 enemies hidden in the shadows. And then the first of the attacks came. It was not a grand battle, not a siege of the city walls, but a series of small, brutal assaults that struck at the heart of the city. The docks were set ablaze, the merchant ships burned to the waterline, and the people who had gathered to watch the fire were attacked by creatures that looked like men but moved like beasts. The Darkspawn had arrived, not in a horde, but in small groups, striking quickly and disappearing into the shadows before the Templars could respond. The city was in chaos, the people running in terror, the soldiers fighting a war that they could not win, for they did not know who the enemy was or where they were hiding. The conspiracy was revealed in the blood that stained the streets of Kirkwall, in the screams of the dying, and in the silence of the survivors who knew that the end was near. The Darkspawn had not come to conquer the city, but to destroy it, to tear it apart from the inside out, to leave nothing but ruins and ash in their wake. And as the city burned, the people of Kirkwall realized that they had been played for fools, that their fear had been used against them, that their trust in the Chantry and the Templars had been misplaced. The Darkspawn had won the first battle, and the war for the soul of the city had just begun. The story of Kirkwall is a story of betrayal, of the betrayal of the people by their leaders, of the betrayal of the mages by the Chantry, and of the betrayal of the world by the Darkspawn. It is a story of the darkness that can hide in the light, of the evil that can wear the face of a friend, and of the pain that comes from the loss of innocence. And as the fires of the city burned, the people of Kirkwall knew that they would never be the same again, that the world they had known was gone, and that a new world was rising from the ashes, a world that was darker, more dangerous, and more uncertain than the one they had left behind. The conspiracy had been successful. The Darkspawn had found a way to strike at the heart of the world, and the war that would follow would be a war that would change the world forever. The legacy of Kirkwall would be one of pain, of the pain of the people who had lost their homes, their families, and their lives in the fire that had consumed the city. It would be a legacy of the Templars who had failed to protect the people, of the mages who had been used as weapons, and of the Darkspawn who had found a way to twist the world to their own ends. And as the smoke cleared from the ruins of the city, the people of Kirkwall would look up at the sky and wonder if the gods were watching, if they cared about the pain and the suffering that had been inflicted upon them, or if they were simply silent, watching the world burn from the safety of the heavens. The silence of the gods was as terrible as the screams of the dying, and the people of Kirkwall would learn that the gods were not their saviors, but their observers, watching the world from a great distance, indifferent to the pain and the suffering that was unfolding below. The Darkspawn conspiracy in Kirkwall was a prelude to the darkness that would soon engulf the world, a warning of the evil that was coming, of the war that would tear the world apart, and of the pain that would be inflicted upon the innocent. And as the story of Kirkwall was told, it would be a story that would be remembered for generations, a story that would serve as a warning to the people of the world, a reminder of the cost of fear, the cost of betrayal, and the cost of the darkness that had been awakened in the heart of the city. The world would never be the same again, and the people of Kirkwall would carry the scars of the war for the rest of their lives, a reminder of the darkness that had come to their city and the pain that had been inflicted upon them. The silence of the grove, the blood that was shed in the name of fear, and the war that would change the world forever were all part of the story of Kirkwall, a story that would be told for generations, a story that would serve as a warning to the people of the world, a reminder of the cost of the darkness that had been awakened in the heart of the city. The silence that fell over Kirkwall was not a true silence, but a heavy, suffocating quiet that pressed against the ears of the world, a pause in the rhythm of history before the great discordance began. While the scars of the city healed, or perhaps merely festered beneath the surface, the foundations of the faith itself were beginning to crack, not with a sudden roar, but with the slow, grinding friction of stones that had been forced together for too long. The chantry, that great edifice of light and order that had stood since the days of Emperor Draken, was no longer a single, unbroken voice. It had become a chorus of conflicting whispers, a fractured mirror, reflecting the deepening shadows of the Tevinter Imperium and the rising tides of fear in the free cities. The schism that would eventually tear the world asunder did not begin with a battle, but with a disagreement over the nature of magic, a theological rift that widened until it became a chasm that no bridge of prayer could span. In the north, the Tevinter Magisters had long held that magic was a tool of the gods, a force to be harnessed by the worthy and the powerful, while the Orlesian Chantry preached that magic existed to serve man and never to rule over him. This simple commandment, once a pillar of unity, became the wedge that drove the two branches of the faith apart, a divergence of belief that would soon manifest in blood and fire. As the years passed, the tension grew like a slow-burning fever, infecting the clerics and the faithful alike. The Chantry of Orlais, once the heart of the Andrastian faith, found itself under siege not by darkspawn, but by the creeping influence of the Quinari and the ancient, unyielding arrogance of Tevinter. The Quinari, with their philosophy of absolute order and the rejection of the Maker, had carved out a kingdom in the north, challenging the very existence of the Chantry's authority. In the south, the Tevinter Imperium, still proud and unrepentant, refused to bow to the divine in Val Royo, maintaining their own hierarchy of magisters who viewed the Chantry as a political tool rather than a spiritual god. The world was becoming a place of competing truths, where the light of the chant was dimmed by the smoke of burning heretics, and the cold, calculated silence of those who had turned away from the Maker. It was in this atmosphere of doubt and fear that the Exalted March began, a movement that was meant to unify the faith, but instead became a crusade of desperation. The Exalted March was not a march of armies, but a march of the soul, a desperate attempt to reclaim the lost lands of the faith and to silence the voices of dissent that had grown too loud to ignore. It was a time when the Templars, those sworn to protect the Chantry and to guard the circles of Magi, were sent out into the world with a new mandate, a mandate that blurred the line between protector and executioner. They were to hunt down the apostates, the maleficars, and those who questioned the authority of the divine, to bring them to justice or to the pyre. The Templars, once the silent guardians of the magical arts, became the visible face of the Chantry's fear, their armor gleaming in the sunlight of the south and the snow of the north, a reminder that the Chantry would not tolerate deviation. The march was a response to the growing unrest, a reaction to the fear that the world was slipping away from the grasp of the Maker, that the darkness was winning, and that only through force could the light be preserved. But the march did not bring unity. It brought division. The Templars, in their zeal to protect the faith, often overstepped their bounds, becoming tyrants in their own right. They hunted down those who were merely different, those who sought to understand the Fade in ways that the Chantry did not approve. The circles of Magi, once places of study and contemplation, became prisons, their inmates watched by Templars who saw them not as brothers and sisters, but as potential threats. The trust between the mages and the Templars, a trust that had been forged in the fires of the First Blight and the Second, began to erode. The mages, feeling the weight of the Chantry's suspicion, began to look for other ways to survive, other ways to understand their power. They turned to the shadows, to the secrets that the Chantry had tried to bury, to the ancient magic that the magisters of Tevinter had kept for themselves. The Exalted March, intended to bring the world back to the light, instead drove many into the darkness, pushing them away from the faith they had once loved. The world watched as the Chantry tore itself apart, as the great house of faith became a battleground of ideology and power. The Templars and the Mages, once united in the face of the Darkspawn, found themselves at war with each other. The Chantry, once the beacon of hope for the people of Thedas, became a symbol of oppression, a reminder of the fear that ruled the hearts of men. The Exalted March ended not with a victory, but with a stalemate, a silence that was more deafening than any battle cry. The world was left in a state of uncertainty, a state of waiting for the next blow, the next betrayal, the next act of violence that would tear the world apart. The Chantry had failed to unify the world, and in its failure, it had created a new kind of darkness, a darkness that was not born of the deep, but of the hearts of men. The silence that followed the exalted march was a silence of fear, a silence of waiting. The people of Thedas, who had once looked to the chantry for guidance, now looked to the shadows, to the secrets that the chantry had tried to hide. The Templars, who had once been the protectors of the faith, were now seen as the enforcers of a dying order. The mages, who had once been the students of the light, were now seen as the architects of the darkness. The world was changing, and the chantry was no longer able to stop it. The exalted march had been a last gasp of a dying order, a final attempt to hold back the tide of change that was sweeping over the world. But the tide was too strong, and the chantry was too weak. The world was moving on, and the chantry was left behind, a relic of a time that was gone, a memory of a faith that had been lost. And yet, even in the darkness, there were those who still believed, those who still held to the light. They were few, scattered across the world, hiding in the shadows, waiting for the day when the chantry would rise again, when the light would return. But for now, the world was in darkness and the chantry was in ruins. The exalted march had been a tragedy that would be remembered for generations, a reminder of the cost of fear, the cost of betrayal, and the cost of the darkness that had been awakened in the heart of the world. The silence of the chantry, the blood that was shed in the name of faith, and the war that would change the world forever, were all part of the story of the exalted march, a story that would be told for generations, a story that would serve as a warning to the people of the world, a reminder of the cost of the darkness that had been awakened in the heart of the world. The world was waiting for the next chapter, the next act of violence, the next betrayal. The chantry was in ruins, but the faith was not dead. It was sleeping, waiting for the day when it would rise again, when the light would return. But for now, the world was in darkness and the chantry was in ruins. The exalted march had been a tragedy that would be remembered for generations, a reminder of the cost of fear, the cost of betrayal, and the cost of the darkness that had been awakened in the heart of the world. The silence of the chantry, the blood that was shed in the name of faith, and the war that would change the world forever, were all part of the story of the exalted march, a story that would be told for generations, a story that would serve as a warning to the people of the world, a reminder of the cost of the darkness that had been awakened in the heart of the world. The gods were watching, as they always did, indifferent to the pain and the suffering that was unfolding below, waiting for the day when the world would be ready for them to return. But for now, the world was in darkness, and the chantry was in ruins. The exalted march had been a tragedy that would be remembered for generations, a reminder of the cost of fear, the cost of betrayal, and the cost of the darkness that had been awakened in the heart of the world. The silence that followed the collapse of the Temple of Sacred Ashes was not a true silence, but a heavy, suffocating absence that seemed to press against the very bones of the world. Where the stone had once stood in solemn grandeur, a scar now marred the sky, a wound in the fabric of reality that bled light and shadow into the material realm. It was the breach, a tear in the veil so vast that it swallowed the sun, casting the valley of the temple into an eternal, bruised twilight. The air itself tasted of ozone and ancient dust, a metallic tang that coated the tongue and signaled the intrusion of the fade into the waking world. It was as if the barrier between the two realms had been scraped raw, leaving the world exposed to the chaotic currents that flowed beneath the surface of existence, currents that had long been kept at bay by the prayers of the faithful and the discipline of the Templars. In the days that followed the explosion, the valley became a graveyard of the living, a place where the dead did not rest and the living could not survive. The red lyrium that had been scattered across the ruins glowed with a sickly, pulsating light, a stain upon the earth that seemed to breathe with a malevolent intelligence. It was the blood of the earth, poisoned by the touch of a god who had forgotten his own name, and it seeped into the soil, turning the grass to ash and the water to a thick, crimson sludge. The demons that poured through the breach were not the minor spirits of the Fade, the shadows that haunted the dreams of the weary, but vast, terrible entities of pure malice and hunger. They walked the ruins with a heavy, deliberate gait, their forms shifting and writhing as they adapted to the harshness of the physical world, tearing through stone and flesh with equal indifference. The divine Justinia V, the voice of the Chantry and the hope of a united Thedas, had fallen in that first moment of cataclysm, her body consumed by the fire that had erupted from the ground. Her death was not merely the loss of a leader, but the extinguishing of a beacon. The conclave, intended to be a gathering of peace, a final attempt to bridge the chasm between the mages and the Templars, had become a slaughterhouse. The rebel mages, the rogue Templars, the diplomats, the scholars, and the pilgrims who had come to witness the end of a war were all gone, their lives snuffed out in a single, blinding instant. The only survivor was the one who had been pulled from the Fade, a figure marked by a strange, green light on their palm, a symbol of a power that did not belong to this world, a power that had been awakened by the very explosion that had nearly destroyed them. As the days passed, the breach grew, its edges fraying and expanding like a wound that refused to heal. The sky above the temple was no longer blue, but a swirling vortex of violet and gray, a storm that never broke, never rained, but simply churned with the energy of a dying star. The light that poured through the tear was not the light of the sun, but a cold, ghostly radiance that cast long, distorted shadows and made the familiar world seem alien and hostile. The trees that had once surrounded the temple were now twisted into grotesque shapes, their branches reaching toward the sky as if pleading for mercy, their leaves turned to ash and falling in silent, gray drifts. The birds had fled, the animals had hidden, and the silence of the valley was broken only by the low, mournful howling of the demons that patrolled the ruins. The Inquisition, born from the ashes of the conclave, was a desperate attempt to hold back the tide. It was a collection of the displaced, the broken, and the hopeful, drawn together by the need to close the breach and restore the order of the world. They moved through the ruins with a heavy, cautious step, their armor dull and scarred, their faces etched with the exhaustion of those who had seen too much. They fought not for glory, but for survival, for the chance to see the sun rise over a world that was not consumed by the darkness. The mark on the palm of the survivor became their only hope, a key that could unlock the doors of the Fade and seal the wound in the sky. But the mark was a burden, a weight that pressed upon the soul, a reminder that the power to save the world was also the power to destroy it. The demons that poured through the breach were a testament to the fragility of the veil. They were not merely monsters, but manifestations of the fears and desires of the Fade, given form and substance by the tear in the sky. Some were small and quick, darting through the ruins like shadows, while others were vast and terrible, towering over the stone pillars of the temple with eyes that burned with a cold, blue fire. They spoke in voices that echoed in the mind, whispering of old betrayals and forgotten sins, tempting the living to give in to their darkest impulses. The air was thick with their presence, a suffocating cloud of malice that made it hard to breathe, hard to think, hard to remember what it was like to be human. The red lyrium that covered the ruins was a poison that seeped into the soul, twisting the minds of those who breathed it in. It was the substance of the ancient Tevinter Magi, a drug that had been used to bind the will of the mages to the gods, but now it served as a catalyst for the breach, feeding the demons and strengthening the tear in the sky. The glow of the lyrium was a sickly, pulsating light that seemed to beat in time with the heart of the world, a reminder that the earth itself was sick, that the foundations of reality were crumbling. The Inquisition moved through the ruins with a sense of urgency, knowing that every moment the breach remained open was a moment that the world was slipping further into chaos. The story of the breach was not just a story of destruction, but of the fragility of the world, of the thin line that separated order from chaos, light from darkness. It was a reminder that the veil was not a wall, but a membrane, a living thing that could be torn by the force of a single act of betrayal. The explosion at the conclave had been the spark that had ignited the fire, but the fuel had been the fear and the hatred that had been building in the hearts of the people of Thedas for years. The breach was the culmination of that fear, the physical manifestation of a world that had forgotten how to trust, how to love, how to live in peace. The gods were watching as they always did, indifferent to the pain and the suffering that was unfolding below. They were the architects of the fade, the creators of the veil, and they had allowed the tear to happen, perhaps as a test, perhaps as a punishment, perhaps simply because they had no other choice. The silence of the gods was as loud as the roar of the demons, a reminder that the world was alone, that the people of Thedas would have to find the strength to save themselves. The Inquisition was their only hope, a small band of survivors who stood between the world and the darkness, who fought with every ounce of their strength to close the breach and restore the light. The ruins of the Temple of Sacred Ashes were a monument to the cost of war, a reminder of the price that had been paid for the freedom of the mages, for the safety of the Templars, for the peace of the world. The blood that had been shed in the name of faith, the lives that had been lost in the name of justice, were all part of the story of the breach, a story that would be told for generations, a story that would serve as a warning to the people of the world. The darkness that had been awakened in the heart of the world was not just a physical force, but a spiritual one, a corruption that had taken root in the souls of the people, a reminder that the greatest enemy was not the demon, but the fear that lived within the heart of the living. As the breach grew, the world began to change. The seasons no longer turned with the rhythm of the sun, but with the whims of the demons. The crops withered in the fields, the rivers ran dry, and the stars were hidden behind the swirling vortex of the sky. The people of Thedas huddled in their villages, afraid to leave their homes, afraid to look up at the sky, afraid of the darkness that was creeping into their world. The Inquisition was the only light in the darkness, a beacon of hope in a world that had forgotten how to hope. They moved through the ruins with a heavy, cautious step, their armor dull and scarred, their faces etched with the exhaustion of those who had seen too much. They fought not for glory, but for survival, for the chance to see the sun rise over a world that was not consumed by the darkness. The mark on the palm of the survivor was a symbol of the power that had been awakened, a power that could close the breach and restore the world. But it was also a symbol of the cost of that power, a reminder that the world could not be saved without a price. The Inquisition knew that they were fighting a battle that they might not win, that the darkness was too strong, that the demons were too numerous. But they also knew that they had no choice, that the world would not wait for them to be ready, that the darkness would consume them all if they did not act. The story of the breach was a story of courage, of sacrifice, of the human spirit's ability to endure in the face of overwhelming odds. It was a story of the light that could be found in the darkest of places, a story of the hope that could be found in the most hopeless of situations. The silence of the ruins was broken only by the sound of the wind, a mournful wail that echoed through the broken pillars and the shattered stone. The wind carried the scent of ash and blood, a reminder of the lives that had been lost, of the dreams that had been shattered. The Inquisition moved through the ruins with a heavy, cautious step, their armor dull and scarred, their faces etched with the exhaustion of those who. The Inquisition moved through the ruins with a heavy, cautious step, their armor dull and scarred, their faces etched with the exhaustion of those who had stared into the abyss and lived to tell the tale. Yet the silence that followed the closing of the great tier was not a peace, but a holding of breath, a fragile pause before the storm broke anew. For the breach was merely the wound, and the body of Thedas was already infected, the sickness spreading from the heart of the world to its distant limbs. The wind that had howled through the shattered temple of sacred ashes now carried whispers of other tragedies, of villages burned and gods awakened, of a darkness that did not wait for the Inquisition to gather its strength, but instead hunted them down with the patience of a predator. The path forward was not a single road but 1,000 fractured trails, each leading to a new horror, each demanding a sacrifice that the world could barely afford to give. Far to the south, in the rolling hills of Ferelden, the village of Redcliffe had long been a place of quiet industry, a beacon of stability in a land scarred by the blight and the wars of men. It was a place where the smoke from the chimneys rose in gentle plumes against the gray sky, where the sound of the forge was a rhythm of life rather than the clashing of steel. But that peace had been shattered, not by the return of the Darkspawn, but by the arrival of an ancient evil that had slumbered beneath the earth for centuries. The mages who had fled the circle of Magi, those who had been hunted as rebels and outcasts, had sought refuge in the castle, believing the walls of stone and the loyalty of the local lord would protect them from the Templars who pursued them. They did not know that the Templars were not the only threat, that the very ground they stood upon was alive with a malevolence that predated the chantry, that predated the gods themselves. The castle of Redcliffe, once a fortress of noble lineage, had become a tomb, its halls echoing with the screams of the dead and the laughter of the mad. The red lyrium, a substance of terrible potency that had seeped into the veins of the world, had awakened the ancient elven gods. The Avar and the Quinari had spoken of them in hushed tones, but the chantry had silenced their names. These gods, or perhaps they were demons of a different order, entities of pure magic and hunger, had risen from the earth to consume the living. The air in the castle was thick with the scent of ozone and rot, a cloying sweetness that masked the stench of death. The walls were stained with the blood of those who had tried to resist, their bodies twisted into grotesque shapes by the magic that flowed unchecked through the stone. The rebels, those who had fought for their freedom, had found themselves trapped between the hammer of the Templars and the anvil of the elven gods, their struggle for survival becoming a tragedy of epic proportions. The Inquisition arrived to find a battlefield that was not of this world, where the laws of physics bent to the will of the awakened entities. The sky above Redcliffe was a bruised purple, the sun hidden behind a veil of unnatural clouds that rained fire upon the earth. The demons that had poured from the rifts were not the simple fearlings or wrath demons of the Fade, but something far more terrible, creatures of flesh and magic that moved with a fluid, unnatural grace. They hunted the survivors, not for food, but for the sheer joy of the hunt, for the pleasure of seeing the light in the eyes of the dying fade into nothingness. The Inquisition moved through the ruins of the village, their boots crunching on the glass that had once been the windows of the homes, their hearts heavy with the knowledge that they were too late for many, that the darkness had already claimed too many souls. In the heart of the castle, the elven gods waited, their forms shifting and changing, never settling into a single shape. They were the embodiment of the old world, the world before the Tevinter Imperium, before the Chantry, before the gods of the current age had risen to take their place. They were hungry, not for flesh, but for the magic that flowed through the veins of the living, the life force that sustained the world. The Inquisition fought them with the power of the Mark, the same power that had closed the breach. But this time the battle was not against a tear in the veil, but against the veil itself, against the ancient forces that sought to tear it down. The Mark burned with a cold fire, a light that cut through the darkness, but the gods were ancient and their power was vast, and the Inquisition was small, a handful of souls against the tide of history. The battle for Redcliffe was a battle for the soul of the world, a struggle between the old and the new, between the darkness that sought to consume and the light that sought to endure. The Inquisition knew that they could not save everyone, that the cost of victory would be high, that the world would be changed forever by the events that unfolded in the castle. But they also knew that they could not turn away, that the darkness would not stop, that it would spread from Redcliffe to the rest of Thedas, consuming everything in its path. They fought with a desperation that was born of hope, a hope that was fragile and easily broken, but a hope nonetheless. They fought for the future, for the chance that the world might survive, that the light might prevail against the darkness. As the battle raged, the sky above Redcliffe began to clear, the unnatural clouds dissipating as the elven gods were driven back, their power broken by the combined might of the Inquisition and the Mark. The silence that followed was not the silence of peace, but the silence of a world that had been changed, a world that had seen the face of the ancient gods and survived. The survivors of the battle moved through the ruins, their faces streaked with soot and blood, their hearts heavy with the weight of what they had done. They had saved Redcliffe, But they had also unleashed a new chapter in the war against the darkness, a chapter that would be written in the blood of the innocent and the tears of the lost. The story of Redcliffe was a story of the past and the future, of the gods that had been forgotten and the demons that had been awakened. It was a story of the price of power, of the cost of survival, of the fragility of the world in the face of the ancient forces that sought to destroy it. The Inquisition knew that the battle was not over, that the darkness was still out there, waiting for its chance to strike again. But they also knew that they had a chance, a small, fragile chance to save the world, to close the rifts, to seal the breach, to restore the balance that had been broken. They moved forward, not with the certainty of victory, but with the determination of those who knew that they had no choice, that the world would not wait for them to be ready, that the darkness would consume them all if they did not act. The wind that had howled through the ruins of Redcliffe now carried the scent of rain, a cleansing rain that washed away the blood and the ash, that washed away the memory of the battle, but not the memory of the dead. The Inquisition stood amidst the ruins, their armor scarred, their faces etched with the exhaustion of those who had fought the gods and lived. They knew that the war was far from over, that the darkness was still out there, waiting for its chance to strike again. But they also knew that they had a chance, a small, fragile chance, to save the world, to close the rifts, to seal the breach, to restore the balance that had been broken. They moved forward, not with the certainty of victory, but with the determination of those who knew that they had no choice, that the world would not wait for them to be ready, that the darkness would consume them all if they did not act. The silence of the ruins was broken only by the sound of the rain, a gentle, rhythmic sound that echoed through the broken pillars and the shattered stone, a sound of hope in the midst of the darkness. But to understand the weight of the silence that now hangs over these mountains, we must first turn our gaze back to the long, slow winter of the war that came before, a conflict that left scars upon the land far deeper than any blade could carve. Before the breach tore the sky asunder, there was the silent grove, a place once known for its whispering leaves and the soft light of the sun filtering through the canopy, a sanctuary where the air was thick with the scent of pine and the quiet prayers of those who sought refuge. It was here, in the shadow of the ancient trees, that the war between the mages and the Templars played out its most tragic acts, not with the grandeur of armies clashing in open fields, but in the quiet, desperate struggles of the hunted and the hunters. The grove became a graveyard of ideals, where the rigid order of the Templars collided with the desperate freedom of the mages, and in that collision, something essential was lost, something that the world would never fully recover. The trees that once stood tall and proud were stripped of their bark, their roots torn from the earth by the magic that had been used as a weapon, and the soil beneath them turned to ash, a testament to the fury that had consumed them. The silence that followed was not the peace of resolution, but the heavy, suffocating quiet of a world holding its breath, waiting for the next blow to fall. It was a silence that echoed in the hearts of those who survived, a reminder that the lines between protector and oppressor had blurred until they were indistinguishable, that the magic meant to heal had been twisted into a tool of destruction, and that the chains meant to bind the dangerous had become the very thing that drove men and women to madness. The legacy of that war was not written in the history books of the Chantry, but in the hollow eyes of the survivors, in the empty cradles of villages that had been burned to the ground, and in the scars that marred the landscape of Thedas. It was a legacy of fear, of mistrust, of a deep, abiding sorrow that could not be washed away by the rain, no matter how long it fell. The mages who had fled into the shadows, the Templars who had lost their faith, the innocent who had been caught in the crossfire, all of them were part of this legacy, a tapestry of pain that stretched across the years, binding the past to the present in a knot that could not be undone. And yet, even in the midst of this devastation, there was a faint glimmer of hope, a stubborn refusal to let the darkness take hold, a belief that perhaps, just perhaps, the cycle of violence could be broken. But that hope was fragile, easily shattered by the slightest touch, easily extinguished by the cold wind that blew through the silent grove, carrying with it the whispers of the dead and the echoes of a war that had no winners. The world had changed, irrevocably altered by the blood that had been spilled, and the silence that followed was a warning, a reminder that the peace they sought was not a gift to be given, but a battle to be fought, a struggle that would demand everything they had. The Inquisition stood upon the shoulders of those who had come before, bearing the weight of their failures and their sacrifices, knowing that the path ahead was fraught with danger and uncertainty. They moved forward, not with the certainty of victory, but with the determination of those who knew that they had no choice, that the world would not wait for them to be ready, that the darkness would consume them all if they did not act. The silence of the ruins was broken only by the sound of the rain, a gentle, rhythmic sound that echoed through the broken pillars and the shattered stone, a sound of hope in the midst of the darkness. The silence that followed the rain was not a true silence, but rather a heavy, suffocating stillness that seemed to press against the eardrums of the world, a waiting breath held by the very stones of Thedas. In the years that stretched out after the fall of the Inquisition, the scars of the war did not fade into memory as one might hope, but instead calcified into the bedrock of reality, becoming a part of the landscape itself. The people of the surface world, those who had survived the chaos, turned their eyes toward the horizon with a mixture of relief and a dawning, unspoken terror, for they had learned that the end of one nightmare was often merely the prelude to a deeper, more ancient horror. The veil, that fragile membrane that separated the waking world from the chaotic dreams of the Fade, had been stretched thin by the efforts of those who sought to mend it, and now it trembled with a vibration that no human eye could see, though the mages felt it in the marrow of their bones, a low hum that spoke of a coming storm that would wash away the very concept of safety. It was in this time of uneasy quiet that the shadows began to lengthen, not from the setting sun, but from a darkness that was rising from within the earth itself. The Blight had returned, but it was not the Blight of old, with its gray skies and its armies of darkspawn marching in unbroken lines across the plains. This was something older, something far more terrible in its precision and its intent. The sixth Blight had arrived not with the roar of 1,000 throats, but with a whisper that slithered through the roots of the ancient trees, a corruption that did not seek to destroy the world, but to remake it in an image that was both beautiful and abhorrent. The Darkspawn, those creatures of the deep, had been altered, their minds sharpened by a new purpose, their bodies twisted into forms that defied the natural order, moving with a grace that was alien to their kin. They were no longer merely beasts of war, but agents of a design that had been waiting in the dark for millennia. A design that had been woven into the fabric of the world by hands that had long since turned to dust. And with the Blight came the return of the gods, or at least, the return of the echoes of gods who had been forgotten by the histories of men. The elven pantheon, those ancient deities who had walked the earth before the First Blight, before the rise of the Tevinter Imperium, before the very concept of the Veil had been conceived, began to stir in the deep places of the world. They were not the benevolent protectors of the stories told to children in the hearthlight of Minrathous, nor were they the distant, uncaring figures of the old elven myths. They were forces of nature, raw and untamed, entities of such immense power that their very presence bent the light around them, warping the air until it shimmered with a heat that was not of the sun. Among them walked the dread wolf, Fenharel, the god of the elves, the bringer of the end, the one who had sought to tear down the veil in the distant past to free his people from the chains of the Quinari and the Tevinter, only to be betrayed and cast into the void. Now he had returned not as a savior, but as a reckoning, a force that would not be denied, a storm that would sweep across the world and leave nothing in its wake but the cold, hard truth of the Fade. The cities of the surface world, those great bastions of human civilization that had stood for centuries, began to crumble under the weight of this new age. Minrathous, the jewel of the Tevinter Imperium, with its towering spires and its intricate web of magic, found itself besieged not by an army, but by a corruption that seeped through the stone and the mortar, turning the very streets into a labyrinth of shadows. The mages of the city, who had once prided themselves on their mastery over the Fade, found their spells failing, their magic twisting back upon them, as if the very essence of their power had been turned against them. The Chantry, that great institution of faith and order, found its temples empty, its priests fleeing in terror as the statues of the Maker seemed to weep black tears, and the holy texts burned with a cold fire that no water could extinguish. The people of Thedas, who had spent so long trying to build a world of peace and stability, found themselves once again at the mercy of forces they could not understand, forces that did not care for their prayers or their pleas. In the deep forests of Arlathan, the last remnant of the ancient elven world, the trees began to bleed a sap that was thick and dark, like the blood of the earth itself. The spirits of the forest, those guardians of the old ways, were driven from their homes, their voices silenced by a roar that shook the ground and shattered the leaves from the branches. The forest, once a place of beauty and wonder, became a place of terror, a place where the shadows moved on their own and the wind carried the whispers of the dead. The elven god of the forest, Elgarnan, the first of the pantheon, rose from his slumber in the heart of the forest, his eyes burning with a light that was not of this world. He was a creature of immense power, a being that had once walked the earth as a god, and now he returned to reclaim what was his, to tear down the veil and bring the world into the light of the Fade, no matter the cost. The world was changing, irrevocably altered by the return of the gods and the rise of the Sixth Blight. The cycle of violence that had plagued Thedas for so long was not breaking, but rather accelerating, spinning faster and faster until it threatened to tear the world apart. The people of the surface world, those who had survived the fall of the Inquisition, found themselves once again at the mercy of forces they could not understand, forces that did not care for their prayers or their pleas. The darkness was not merely a shadow that fell across the land, but a presence that filled the air, a weight that pressed down on the hearts of all who lived in the world. The silence that had followed the rain was now broken by the sound of the gods, a sound that was not of this world, a sound that spoke of a coming end that would sweep away the very concept of safety. And yet, even in the midst of this devastation, there was a faint glimmer of hope, a stubborn refusal to let the darkness take hold. The people of Thedas, those who had survived the fall of the Inquisition, found themselves once again at the mercy of forces they could not understand, forces that did not care for their prayers or their pleas. The darkness was not merely a shadow that fell across the land, but a presence that filled the air, a weight that pressed down on the hearts of all who lived in the world. The silence that had followed the rain was now broken by the sound of the gods, a sound that was not of this world, a sound that spoke of a coming end that would sweep away the very concept of safety. The world had changed, irrevocably altered by the blood that had been spilled, and the silence that followed was a warning, a reminder that the peace they sought was not a gift to be given, but a battle to be fought, a struggle that would demand everything they had. The Inquisition stood upon the shoulders of those who had come before, bearing the weight of their failures and their sacrifices, knowing that the path ahead was fraught with danger and uncertainty. They moved forward, not with the certainty of victory, but with the determination of those who knew that they had no choice, that the world would not wait for them to be ready, that the darkness would consume them all if they did not act. The silence of the ruins was broken only by the sound of the rain, a gentle, rhythmic sound that echoed through the broken pillars and the shattered stone, a sound of hope in the midst of the darkness. The silence of the ruins was a fragile thing, easily shattered by the footsteps of those who had gathered in the shadow of the lighthouse, a beacon of light that stood defiant against the encroaching darkness of the Fade. They were not an army in the traditional sense, lacking the banners of kings or the gold of empires, but a collection of broken souls and weary warriors bound together by a singular, desperate purpose. Among them walked Rook, a figure whose face was a canvas of choices made and paths taken, a traveler who had risen from the ashes of the crossroads to stand as the second in command of the Veilguard. Whether born of human flesh, elven grace, dwarven stone, or Quinari might, this champion carried the weight of a world that was fracturing at its seams, their presence a quiet anchor in a storm that threatened to tear the veil between worlds asunder. The air around them hummed with a tension that was palpable, a vibration that spoke of the gods who had awakened, ancient and terrible, and who now sought to reshape reality in their own image, indifferent to the lives that would be extinguished in the process. The journey that had brought them to this precipice was one of quiet accumulation, a gathering of strength not through conquest, but through the mending of old wounds and the forging of new alliances. In the deep, mist-shrouded woods of Arlathan, the team had walked among the ghosts of the elven past, where the trees whispered of a time before the gods had fallen and the world had been whole. There, the silence was different, heavy with the memory of a civilization that had been erased, a reminder of what was at stake if the gods were allowed to rewrite the tapestry of existence. The Veilguard moved through the forest with a reverence that bordered on fear, their footsteps soft on the moss-covered earth, as if afraid that the very sound of their breathing might disturb the slumber of the spirits that lingered in the shadows. It was here, amidst the ruins of a lost paradise, that the true nature of their enemy began to take shape, not as a single monster to be slain, but as a fundamental corruption of the world itself, a hunger that sought to consume the very concept of the veil that separated the mortal realm from the chaotic energies of the Fade. In the cold, wind-swept peaks of Hosberg, the air was thin and biting, a stark contrast to the humid warmth of the forests below. Yet the threat was the same, a pervasive sense of dread that settled into the bones of those who dared to venture there. The Veilguard had sought out the Wardens, the ancient order of those who had long since given up their lives to the Blight, only to find that the darkness had taken on a new form, one that was not bound by the ancient cycles of the Grey. The mountains stood as silent sentinels, their peaks piercing the clouds, watching over the struggle of the mortals below, indifferent to the fate of the world. It was in these high places that the Veilguard found their resolve tested, for the cold was not merely a physical sensation, but a metaphor for the emotional distance that the gods had placed between themselves and the creatures they had created. The silence of the mountains was a warning, a reminder that the world was vast and indifferent, and that the only thing that could stand against the gods was the unity of those who refused to be broken. The lighthouse, now the heart of their resistance, was a place of quiet contemplation, a sanctuary where the weary could rest and the wounded could heal. Within its walls, the air was filled with the soft murmur of voices, the clinking of cups, and the occasional crackle of the fire that burned in the hearth, a symbol of the warmth and life that they were fighting to preserve. Rook moved through the corridors with a quiet grace, their presence a source of comfort to the companions who had gathered there, each of them a story of survival and sacrifice. Neve, the crow who had learned to trust again, walked with a steady gait, her eyes sharp and alert, always watching for the next threat that might emerge from the shadows. Davrin, the elf who had seen the fall of his people, carried the weight of his past in the set of his shoulders, a reminder of the cost of the gods' hubris. Tosh, the Quinari who had found a new purpose in the struggle, moved with a quiet intensity, her presence a testament to the strength that could be found in the most unlikely of places. The bond that had formed between them was not one of blood or of duty, but of shared experience, a connection that had been forged in the fires of adversity and tempered by the cold winds of uncertainty. They were a family of choice, a group of individuals who had come together to face a threat that was greater than the sum of its parts. The silence that fell over the lighthouse when they gathered was not one of emptiness, but of anticipation, a moment of stillness before the storm broke. They knew that the gods were coming, that the darkness was closing in, and that the time for preparation was ending. The world was holding its breath, waiting to see if the Veilguard would rise to the occasion, if they would be able to stand against the gods and protect the world from the destruction that threatened to consume it. The sound of the rain had returned, a gentle, rhythmic sound that echoed through the broken pillars and the shattered stone, a sound of hope in the midst of the darkness. It was a reminder that the world was still alive, that the cycle of life and death continued, and that the gods were not all-powerful. The Veilguard stood ready, their weapons drawn, their hearts set on the task ahead. They knew that the path forward was fraught with danger and uncertainty, that the gods were powerful and cunning, and that the cost of failure was the end of the world as they knew it. Yet, they also knew that they had no choice, that the world would not wait for them to be ready, that the darkness would consume them all if they did not act. They moved forward, not with the certainty of victory, but with the determination of those who knew that they had no choice, that the world would not wait for them to be ready, that the darkness would consume them all if they did not act. The silence of the ruins was broken only by the sound of the rain, a gentle, rhythmic sound that echoed through the broken pillars and the shattered stone, a sound of hope in the midst of the darkness. The gods were coming, and the Veilguard was ready to meet them. The final stand was not a moment of glory, but a moment of quiet resolve, a moment where the fate of the world would be decided not by the might of armies, but by the strength of the hearts of those who refused to give up. The darkness was heavy, the air thick with the weight of the coming storm, but the Veilguard stood firm, their backs against the lighthouse, their eyes fixed on the horizon where the gods were gathering. They knew that the battle ahead would be long and bloody, that the cost would be high, and that many would not survive the night. Yet they also knew that they were fighting for something greater than themselves, for the future of the world, for the right to exist in a universe that was not ruled by the whims of the gods. The silence of the ruins was broken only by the sound of the rain, a gentle, rhythmic sound that echoed through the broken pillars and the shattered stone, a sound of hope in the midst of the darkness.